The Cold War, 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. The end of the Cold War. The Cold War began in the aftermath of World War II. It can best be described as a sustained state of political and military tension between the Soviet Union and their allies, and the United States and their allies. After World War II, the USSR and the US were left as the remaining two superpowers. However, they had profound economic and political differences. The name Cold War comes from the fact that the US and the USSR never faced off with one another in a direct military action. Since both sides possessed nuclear weapons, any direct action may have resulted in what came to be known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction. Throughout this period, as you've already learned, cycles of relative calm would be followed by high tension. You've already learned about the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, the Berlin crisis of 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In this module, you have already addressed one of the most prolonged Cold War battles, the Vietnam War. Even though the Vietnam War did not end until 1975, the 1970s saw the beginning of a Cold War thawing. The 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s saw conflict, compromise, and eventual resolution in regard to the ideological debate between the U.S. and the USSR. From the period of détente ushered in by the Nixon administration to the American involvement in Latin America in the 1980s, and finally as the hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin in 1991, the final days of the Cold War were monumental. Richard Nixon was elected to the U.S. presidency in 1968 and again in 1972. Despite his reputation as a rabid anti-communist, and despite his ongoing mission to resolve the war in Vietnam, Nixon took a major foreign policy step in 1972. Nixon, along with Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor turned Secretary of State, helped bring about détente with China and a reduction in Cold War tension when he traveled to Beijing in 1972. This was the first step down the path to a formal U.S. recognition of Red China as a sovereign state and legitimate power. Détente is a French word for relaxation and is used to describe the easing of strained relations, especially in a political situation, particularly during the Cold War era. Of course, this visit also helped take advantage of the tense situation that existed between China and the Soviet Union, the two great communist regimes. Nixon used the new relationship that he had forged with China to pressure the USSR into entering talks that would reduce the number of missiles each country now had in their nuclear arsenals. This was the beginning of SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. These were two rounds of talks between the U.S. and the USSR focused on the issue of armament control. The first negotiations began in Helsinki, Finland in 1973. SALT I led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and an interim agreement between the two powers. This did not put an end to the arms race as many had hoped. However, it did serve to reduce Cold War tensions and is yet another example of Nixon's movement towards détente. When President Ford took office after the resignation of Richard Nixon, he continued this move towards détente when he signed the Helsinki Accords. This declaration was signed in an attempt to improve relations between the Communist bloc and the West. The agreement recognized post-World War II borders and called for the signatory nations to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. It also called for cooperation in economic, scientific, and humanitarian concerns. Even though the Helsinki Accords were not binding because they did not have official treaty status, this document is still seen as a significant step towards reducing Cold War tension. SALT II was negotiated between President Jimmy Carter, who took office in 1977, and Soviet Union leader Leonid Brezhnev. It was a continuation of the progress made during the SALT I talks and was the first nuclear arms treaty which saw a real reduction in strategic nuclear weapons. Limits were set on the number of strategic launchers and the various types of missiles. Each side was limited to no more than 2,400 weapon systems. SALT II was sent to the U.S. Senate for ratification. But due to tensions between the two countries, the treaty was never ratified. However, some of the standards set in SALT II were voluntarily being observed by the two sides. Competition between the U.S. and the USSR was omnipresent. The competition played out in the space race, the nuclear arms race, but also on the hockey rink. In a medal round hockey game during the 1980 Winter Games, the U.S. hockey team had their miracle on ice as they defeated the Soviet team, who had won nearly every world championship and Olympic tournament since 1954. Team USA went on to win the gold medal by winning its last match over Finland. The Soviet Union took the silver medal by defeating Sweden in its final game. This was a big boost for the American people. Unfortunately, the U.S. and its allies boycotted the 1980 Summer Games in Moscow to protest the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. The 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan spurred President Carter to issue an ultimatum on January 20th, 1980, that the United States would boycott the Moscow Olympics if Soviet troops did not withdraw from Afghanistan within 1 month. The Soviets did not comply. The rivalry and competition between these superpowers was still very intense. In January 1981, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States. He was partially elected on a platform opposed to the concessions of détente. Reagan focused his Cold War policy around increasing spending for defense and aid to anti-communist forces in Latin America. His administration spent billions of dollars to build up both the Army and the Navy. The defense budget grew from $171 billion in 1981 to over $300 billion in 1985. The administration also increased spending on the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. This plan called for the use of ground and space-based systems to protect the United States from attack by strategic nuclear ballistic missiles. Lasers and particle beams would be used to destroy missiles in space before they could reach the U.S. The ambitious initiative was widely criticized as being unrealistic, and many believed it would spark an offensive arms race. It was soon given the nickname Star Wars, after the popular 1977 film by the same name. Nonetheless, it was never truly developed or deployed. In Latin America, Reagan worked to keep out communist influences, even if it was at the cost of supporting right-wing dictators. His administration supported the Contras, who sought to overthrow the Sandinistas, who had taken over Nicaragua in 1979. Yet the Democrats in Congress who opposed these actions passed the Boland Amendment in 1985 that restricted further aid to the Contras. To circumvent this law, members of the Reagan administration, allegedly without his knowledge, sold weapons to the Iranians and took that money and funneled it to the Contras so they could continue their fight. This scheme was uncovered and became known as the Iran-Contra affair. The Cold War scene was doing nothing but intensifying in the early 1980s. Reagan had renewed the arms race. However, in 1985, a new leader emerged in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was a reformer who believed in glasnost and perestroika. In the 1980s, the Soviet economy was in terrible shape. In an effort to reform the country, Gorbachev instituted these two policies. Perestroika refers to the reconstruction of the political and economic system. Politically, citizens started to have a slight say in government. Economically, there was a call for demonopolization and the formation of some private businesses. The term glasnost means openness and called for more rights and freedoms for the Soviet people. To make the aforementioned policies work, Gorbachev had to step back from the arms race with the United States. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev met and decided to remove all intermediate-range missiles from their arsenals. Tear down this wall, referring to the Berlin Wall, was the challenge issued by Reagan to Gorbachev on June 12, 1987. This was a physical reminder of the division between the Communist East and the Capitalist West. But the Soviets, under Gorbachev, were making progress, and in 1988 decided to pull troops out of Afghanistan. By the end of Reagan's second term, the end of the Cold War seemed to be near. On January 20th, 1989, George H.W. Bush was sworn in as the 41st president. Communism around the globe seemed to be unraveling. On June 4th, 1989, in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China, however, a demonstration ended in death. Beijing protesters were crushed by the Communist Chinese government, resulting in a large number of deaths. By December 3rd, 1989, at the end of the Malta Summit, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and U.S. President George H.W. Bush declared that a long-lasting era of peace had begun. The next year, the Berlin Wall fell, and Germany began the reunification process. In July 1991, the Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved. In December of that year, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. The hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time. The United States was now left as the sole remaining superpower in the world. The Cold War was over.